couple more points in regards to artillery. There's a unique type of artillery in the game called regimental artillery, or battalion guns for short. These are guns which were directly attached to infantry battalions and are utilized by the infantry battalion to increase their firepower in close-range musketry firefights. These guns really are not used for ranged fire, so hence in the game they only have a 4-inch range, even though the guns in theory can fire further. And all they do for the game is increase the firepower of the actual individual battalion of infantry. So if the battalion of infantry in a certain circumstance had a 50% base firepower, you would add 20% base firepower to the battalion for a total of base firepower of 70%, which then of course is modified for terrain and things of that nature. It doesn't increase the minimum fire zone for the infantry battalion. That is still retained as being 2 inches, even though the cannon can fire out to 4. All it's effectively doing is increasing the firepower of the individual battalion. An example of a regimental artillery or battalion guns attached to a battalion is here in the foreground. All it is an extra figure, somewhat of a gunner type figure, and he's typically placed immediately behind the infantry battalion which he is attached to. You don't usually put him amongst the standard figures of the battalion, just have him loosely behind. And this does not make this battalion a mass target. This is basically a marker. Now, if in combat the infantry battalion is actually routed in shock combat, that's an actual R result, the gunner figure is automatically removed in addition to the 2 figures you normally lose in shock combat. Otherwise, if the battalion retires, the gunners can go back with it, unless it's of course a rout result. Other than that, if the battalion is ever reduced in strength to less than half strength, the guns are automatically removed at the same time as you remove the figure which takes them below half strength. Now the guns or themselves can be moved amongst individual battalions of the same regiment. You cannot go between different regiments. And if so, all you need to do in a movement phase is pick up the gunner figure and make a normal move and go attached to a different battalion. And then they'll be utilized, the guns of that battalion, in their firefight. So they can be exchanged back and forth as long as the battalions are in formed order. If they're routing, obviously you cannot attach or detach the gunners because they are also in a state of rout. Other than that, it's quite simple. It's just adding an additional fire factor in the initial firefights. Now let's bring up one other point. Overhead fire or firing artillery over a friendly formed unit, not a screen or skirmisher type formation, and impacting the enemy beyond. Here we have an example of a couple of French batteries up on a low hill. We have a French Léger battalion in front, and then we have some Prussian infantry in front of the Léger battalion engaged in a musketry firefight. Now the question is, could these guns fire over the heads of the friendly troops and impact or cause damage to this Prussian line? And the answer is no. We use the halfway rule, which basically means from the forward edge of the guns to the forward edge of the friendly troops, you measure that distance. And that distance then creates a dead zone distance equal from the front edge of the friendly battalion out. So in this case, this battalion would be in a dead zone. Now if you're on a 2-layer hill, then it would be this distance but only half the distance on this side. In other words, you've adjusted it for twice the level of the height. But typically it's a case of one elevation. Now that doesn't stop the guns from firing over friendly troops and past this unit and impacting somebody over here in the background area. For instance, hitting these screens or hitting these lines. That's a perfectly valid target because again it's this distance plus the same distance over, which would put it to about here. Any target beyond this point, i.e. these units over here, are viable targets. Which brings up one last little thing. If you fire over enemy troops, and enemy troops have got screens in front of them, or they do not have screens in front of them, and you attempt to engage units in the rear area, in other words, firing from here to here, and pretend that this French Léger battalion is not here. Instead of engaging this battalion, you wish to engage this battalion. And to make it a little bit more simplistic, I'm not going to even have the screen out there. If you so wish to do it, that's perfectly fine. But in doing so, again assuming this battalion is not present, by firing over this battalion, you've automatically made this battalion the equivalency of a screened target. So most likely you're always going to fire at the nearest target. But sometimes players might elect, or there might be a restriction for some other reason, why they might wish to engage the battalions in behind. In summary, when you're firing with overhead weaponry, or over from a high hill over friendly troops, you measure the distance from the forward part of the battery to the forward part of the friendly unit, which creates an equal distance of dead zone, which then determines you can fire somebody beyond that said dead zone. Regimental artillery is usually symboled by a detached gunner-type looking figure, who's usually placed immediately behind the battalion, usually in some formation like alongside like this. So it's a representative marker, and then both sides know that that battalion has regimental artillery attached. If the battalion is drawn under half strength, or the battalion actually routs from shock combat, then the regimental artillery is automatically removed, in addition to any additional losses required by the said combat.